If I had to choose one body measurement to predict who will develop diabetes, heart disease, fatty liver, and dementia in the next 10 years, it wouldn't be their weight. It wouldn't even be their BMI. It would be their waist size. The circumference of your waist tells us something that your weight never can. It tells us about the fat wrapped around your organs, the fat that's metabolically active, inflammatory, and slowly degrading your health from the inside out. Now, before I go any further, I need to say something really important there. Talking about weight and body size is really sensitive. There's real hurther for a lot of people. There's real frustration. I know that because there's obesity in my own family, and I was technically overweight for a long time in medical school, weighing over 16 stone. So when I talk about this sort of thing, it's not from a place of judgment or superiority. It comes from a genuine desire to give you the facts and help you understand your body better. It's not about shame or appearance. It's about metabolic signals that your body is sending you. My name's Dr. Alex, and over the last 10 years working in the emergency department, I've become obsessed with the patterns and the numbers that predict who lives longer and who lives healthier. What I want to do with this channel is give you the insights that I've gathered over the years, the kind of education that our doctors simply don't have time to provide in a 10-minute appointment. In return, all I ask is that if you found something useful in this video, then please subscribe to the channel. It really does help this video reach more people who need to hear it. So, most of why BMI doesn't tell the full story yous have stood on a scale at some point and had our weight converted into a BMI number. Above 25, you're overweight. Above 30, you're obese. It's simple, it's quick, it's easy to calculate. But there's what most people don't know. BMI was never designed to diagnose health. It was created in the 1800s by a Belgian mathematician who was studying populations, not individuals. He wanted a quick way to categorize large groups of people for statistical analysis. It was a population-level tool that somehow became a personal health metric. The fundamental flaw with BMI is this. It can't distinguish between fat and muscle, and it can't tell you where your fat is located. Now, a rugby player with loads of muscle mass might have a BMI of 28, technically overweight, but they might have virtually no health risk. Meanwhile, someone with a normal BMI of 23 might carry significant fat around their midsection and be at really high metabolic risk. Completely different health outcomes. The scale treats all weight the same, but biology doesn't. To understand why waist size, subcutaneous versus visceral fat, the fat that matters so much, you need to know that your body stores fat in two completely different compartments. The first one is subcutaneous fat, the fat that you can pinch just beneath your skin on your arms or legs or hips or thighs. It's relatively inert, it stores energy, but it doesn't cause much metabolic trouble. Some of it is even protective, particularly the fat stored in the lower body. The second compartment is visceral fat. Now, this is the fat that wraps around your internal organs. Your liver, your pancreas, your intestines, even your heart. You can't see it from the outside and you can't pinch it, obviously, but it's there. It's tucked deep inside your abdomen. And unlike subcutaneous fat, visceral fat is metabolically hyperactive. It doesn't just sit there quietly. It behaves like an endocrine organ, pumping out hormones and inflammatory molecules that interfere with how your body processes glucose, regulates appetite, and manages inflammation. When you measure your waist circumference, you're getting a direct proxy for how much visceral fat you're carrying, and that's why it predicts disease risk so accurately. Let me walk you through what visceral fat does to insulin, liver, triglycerides. Visceral fat actually does biologically. Because once you understand the mechanism, everything else starts to make sense. Visceral fat cells release inflammatory molecules called cytokines that travel through your bloodstream and trigger chronic low-grade inflammation throughout your body. They interfere with insulin signaling in your muscles and your liver. They make your cells less responsive to insulin. Your pancreas then has to produce more and more insulin just to get the same job done. Now, at the same time, visceral fat constantly releases free fatty acids directly into the portal vein, which is the big vein that drains straight into your liver. Your liver gets bombarded with fat and starts accumulating inside its cells, a condition called, no surprise, fatty liver. Now, a fatty liver doesn't just sit there harmlessly. It becomes insulin resistant, which means it stops responding to insulin signals to stop producing glucose. So what happens is your liver keeps churning out sugar even when your blood sugar is already high. It also ramps up production of triglycerides, which increases your cardiovascular risk. And here's where it compounds. High insulin levels tell your body to store more fat. And when insulin is chronically elevated, your body preferentially stores that fat as visceral fat. You end up in this vicious cycle that's incredibly difficult to break without changing the underlying inputs. This cascading metabolic dysfunction starts in your abdomen and radiates outward, affecting your liver, your blood vessels, your brain, and ultimately your lifespan. Large cohort. Why waist size predicts mortality better than weight of studies involving hundreds of thousands of people have consistently shown that waist circumference predicts the risk of type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and all-cause mortality much better than BMI does. Even when you control for BMI, meaning you compare two people with the same weight and heights, the person with a larger waist has significantly worse outcomes. One study published in the Mayo Clinic followed over 65,000 adults and found that people with larger waist circumferences had higher mortality risk at every BMI category, including those with normal weight. And the reason is simple. Waist size reflects visceral fat, and visceral fat drives metabolic disease. You can be heavy because you're muscular and metabolically healthy. You can be light because you have low muscle mass and high visceral fat. The scale can't see the difference, but a tape measure can. This is why doctors are increasingly moving away from weight-based assessments and focusing on waist circumference, waist-to-hip ratio, and body composition. And this brings us the skinny fat risk. Normal BMI, high visceral fat, to a group of people who fly completely under the radar using traditional weight-based metrics, despite being at serious metabolic risk. These individuals have a normal BMI, say 22 or 23, but they carry significant fat around their midsection and have very little muscle mass. From the outside, they look slim. On paper, their weight is fine, but metabolically, they're in big trouble. They often have high triglycerides, elevated fasting insulin, fatty liver, and poor glucose tolerance. They might have normal cholesterol, but a terrible HDL to triglyceride ratio. They're insulin resistant, despite being thin. And because their weight doesn't raise any red flags, they're not screened, they're not warned, and they're not treated until something serious happens, like a heart attack or a stroke or a diabetes diagnosis. You can look thin and be metabolically sick, and that's precisely why waist circumference is such a powerful screening tool. It catches the people that weight-based metrics miss. So waist size and high blood pressure explained. What's the connection between waist size and high blood pressure? So most people think the high blood pressure is about eating too much salt. And while sodium matters, the bigger driver is often insulin resistance. When your cells become resistant to insulin, your body compensates by producing more insulin. Chronically elevated insulin causes your kidneys to retain sodium and water, which increases blood volume and raises your blood pressure. At the same time, the inflammation caused by visceral fat stiffens your blood vessels, making them less flexible and less able to regulate pressure properly. Visceral fat also produces a molecule called angiotensinogen, which gets converted into angiotensin II, a powerful vasoconstrictor that raises your blood pressure. So the fat around your organs isn't just passively sitting there. It's actively secreting hormones and inflammatory signals that push your blood pressure up. This is why hypertension often emerges alongside other metabolic conditions. It's not a separate disease. It's part of the same underlying dysfunction that begins with visceral fat and insulin resistance. Reducing your waist size doesn't just improve your metabolic markers. It often brings your blood pressure down without medication. Now, the effects of visceral waist size, brain health, cognition, dementia, risk fat extend all the way to your brain. Insulin resistance doesn't just affect your muscles and your liver, it affects your brain cells too. Your brain relies on insulin signaling for things like memory formation and synaptic plasticity. When that signaling is impaired, cognitive function declines. Studies using MRI imaging have shown that people with higher waist circumference tend to have smaller hippocampal volumes. Now, the hippocampus is the part of your brain responsible for memory and learning. They also have higher rates of dementia and Alzheimer's later in life, which is crazy to think about. One study published in the Journal of Neurology followed nearly 7,000 people and found that those with the largest waist circumference had significantly higher dementia risk, even after adjusting for other cardiovascular risk factors. And the pathway here is clear. Central fat leads to vascular and metabolic injury, which leads to brain inflammation and degeneration, which leads to cognitive decline. Your waist size today is shaping your brain health decades from now. And when you look at this through that lens, the stakes become very different. We're talking about protecting your ability to think, tormember, and function independently as you age. Now, I know what some of you waist-to-height ratio, the 0.5 rule, are thinking right now. I'm 6'5" and naturally broad-shouldered. Of course, my waist is going to be bigger. Or the opposite. I'm petite and I carry fat around my middle even though my waist circumference is reasonable. This is important because waist size isn't just an absolute number. Context matters. What we're really looking at is waist circumference relative to your height. This is why researchers prefer waist-to-height ratio. The guideline is really easy here. Your waist in centimeters should be less than half your height in cm. So if you're 180 centimeters tall, your waist should be ideally below 90 centimeters. If you're 160, then below 80 centimeters. This ratio accounts for the fact that taller people naturally have larger frames. A 95 centimeter waist on someone who's 6'4" is very different metabolically from a 95 centimeter waist on someone who's 5'6". The tall person might be perfectly healthy. The shorter person is likely carrying significant visceral fat. For those who are naturally petite but carrying fat around the middle, the absolute number might look fine on paper, but relative to your height, it could still indicate excess visceral fat. This is where looking at other markers becomes really useful. Things like your fasting glucose, triglycerides, HDL cholesterol, blood pressure. If those are off, even with a normal waist size, it tells you something about what's happening metabolically. Your body composition matters more than hitting some generic cutoff. And here's why this isn't willpower, ultra-processed food environment. What makes me quite angry when we talk about these sorts of things? Obesity rates have skyrocketed over the past 50 years, and we've been told it's a failure of personal responsibility. People just need more willpower, more discipline, and more self-control. But humans didn't suddenly lose discipline in 1980. What changed was the food environment. Ultra-processed foods became cheap, ubiquitous, and aggressively marketed. These foods are engineered to override your body's natural satiety signals. They're hyper-palatable, they are calorie-dense, they're designed to make you want more, they're sold in massive portions, advertised to children, and placed at eye level in every single supermarket and petrol station. You can't go anywhere without seeing an advert for something that looks delicious. You aren't weak for struggling against this system. You're human. You don't blame somebody's lungs for getting cancer after decades of cigarette advertising and social normalization of smoking when they started back in the 1930s or whatever. You recognize that the environment shaped the outcome. Well, the same is true here. Addictive inputs create predictable outcomes. And until we acknowledge that, we'll keep blaming individuals for systemic failures. And governments of all colors are guilty of this. And this compassion plus biology, no shame, just physiology, brings me to something really crucial. Fat shaming doesn't work. Shame does not motivate sustainable change. Shame raises cortisol. It worsens stress. It triggers emotional eating, and it drives people away from healthcare. People live with obesity. People live with larger bodies, and every single one of those people deserves dignity. They deserve respect and compassionate healthcare at every size. But pretending that visceral fat is biologically harmless is also not compassionate. It's not kind to withhold information that could help someone understand their body and make informed decisions. You can respect people and also acknowledge biology at the same time. These two things are not in conflict. What I'm offering here is not judgment of any sort, it's physiology, and physiology is neutral. Your body doesn't care about your intentions or your efforts. It responds to inputs. And if we can understand those inputs, then we can change the output. So let's bring. Why ultra-processed foods drive belly fat, This back to ultra-processed foods. What do they do metabolically? Because this is where visceral fat accumulation actually happens. These foods are typically low in protein and fiber, which are the two nutrients that keep you full. They're high in refined carbohydrates and seed oils, which cause rapid spikes in blood glucose and large insulin responses. And as we've already seen, chronically high insulin specifically promotes visceral fat storage. Ultra-processed foods also often come in liquid form, things like Coke or Fanta or fruit juices or smoothies, energy drinks. Liquid calories don't trigger the same satiety response as solid food, so you consume far more energy without feeling full. On top of that, these foods are engineered to have what's called a bliss point, the perfect combination of sugar, salt, and fat that maximizes pleasure and minimizes satiety signaling. Your brain lights up like you've taken a drug, literally, and you keep eating well past nutritional need. The result here is chronic calorie surplus, chronic insulin elevation, and preferential storage of fat in the visceral compartment. It's not a moral failure, it's a biological response to an unnatural food environment. But here's the good news. The good news, visceral fat responds fast. Here's the part that should give you hope. Visceral fat is metabolically active, which means it's also highly responsive to change. When you start eating in a way that stabilizes your blood sugar and lowers your insulin, visceral fat is often the first fat to go. It shrinks faster than subcutaneous fat. Even modest lifestyle changes, things like improving your diet, increasing your protein intake, adding resistance training, improving your sleep, all of these preferentially reduce visceral fat before you see changes anywhere else. This is why people often notice their weight shrinking before the scale moves significantly. You're losing the dangerous fat first. Your lip starts to clear out. Your insulin sensitivity improves. Your inflammation drops. All of this happens relatively quickly, often within weeks of making consistent changes. Biology is not fixed. It's dynamic. And visceral fat, because it's symptobolically active, is one of the most changeable aspects of your physiology. The 4 biggest levers to reduce visceral fat. Now, if I had to give you the 4 most powerful levers for reducing visceral fat, they would be these. The first one is stabilizing your blood sugar. That means prioritizing whole foods, minimizing refined carbohydrates, and avoiding the insulin spikes that drive storage. The second one is prioritizing protein and fiber. Protein keeps you full. It preserves muscle mass and has a high thermic effect. Fiber slows down glucose absorption and feeds your gut bacteria, which produce metabolites that improve insulin sensitivity. The third one is resistance training. Building muscle increases your metabolic rate and improves how your body partitions nutrients. Instead of storing excess energy as fats, you store it as glycogen in the muscle. You become more insulin sensitive. Your body composition shifts even if your weight doesn't. The fourth one is sleep and stress regulation. Poor sleep raises cortisol. It impairs glucose tolerance and increases hunger hormones. Chronic stress does the same thing. You can't outtrain or outeat bad sleep and chronic stress. These aren't diet tricks. They're physiological optimization strategies. And they work because they address the root causes of visceral fat accumulation, which are insulin resistance, inflammation, and metabolic dysfunction. One of the most frustrating, why the scale misleads, body recomposition. Things I see is that people make genuine progress, but they get discouraged because the scale hasn't moved. They've been lifting weights, they've been eating better, they've been sleeping more, their clothes fit better, their waist is genuinely smaller, but the scale reads the same, so they're thinking that they're failing. What's actually happening is body recomposition. They're losing fat and gaining muscle at roughly the same rate. So their weight stays stable, but muscle is denser than fat. A kilo of muscle takes up less space than a kilo of fat. So even though the scale hasn't budged, they've become leaner. They've become stronger and metabolically healthier. This is why waist circumference is a much better marker of progress than scale weight. Your waist size reflects what's happening to your visceral fat, your metabolic health, and your disease risk. The scales just tell you your relationship with gravity, so measure your waist, track how your clothes fit, pay attention to your energy, your sleep, and your strength. Those are the metrics that matter. There's some waist as a vital sign, cut-offs plus ethnicity. Argument to say that we should be treating waist circumference the way wet-read blood pressure or HbA1c, a bit of a vital sign. It's measurable, it's modifiable, and it's predictive. Increased risk generally starts above roughly 94 centimeters for men and 80 centimeters for women, though this varies by ethnicity. South Asian populations, for example, carry higher metabolic risk at smaller waist sizes, and as we discussed earlier, these numbers need to be considered relative to your height and your frame. But here's the key. This isn't about hitting some arbitrary number to feel worthy. It's about having a feedback signal. Just like you wouldn't ignore rising blood pressure, you shouldn't ignore a rising waistline. It's not just a normal part of getting older. It's your body telling you something about what's happening inside. And feedback signals exist so you can respond, adjust, and improve. There's no moral judgment in a tape measure. It's just data, and data, when you understand it, gives you a lot of power. So here's my final thoughts. Longevity, brain health, and control final take on this. Visceral fat is metabolically active, which means it's also highly responsive to change. You're not sentenced to poor metabolic health because of your genetics or your past. You can change the inputs, you can shift the system, you can reduce visceral fat, you can improve insulin sensitivity, you can lower inflammation and dramatically reduce your risk of chronic disease. So measure it, get a tape measure and understand it, and then do something about it. Not so you look a certain way, but because you deserve to feel good, you deserve to think clearly and live as long and as well as possible.